Good morning or good afternoon, depending on what side of the country you're coming in from. Charlie McQueen, President McQueen Financial Advisors. Welcome to our ALM 201 webinar. Really excited for today's webinar, and I'm joined by two incredible human beings. Um, we'll start off with, well, actually, it's always fun to talk. We have our three main product lines, our asset liability management, our investment advisory business, and our valuation and transaction advisory business. And today we're talking ALM, and fortunate here to have our leader of asset liability management and CECL and analytics, Heather Shepperly. Heather, thank you for joining us. Super excited to have you here with your knowledge of ALM, interest rate risk, CECL, uh, data, bad data, good data, all things data. Thank you for joining us, Heather.
Thank you for having me. All the math nerdery is definitely my world. Excited to talk more about it.
Yep, absolutely. Well, joining Heather is the gentleman who we call the professor. We have one of our incredible senior advisors, Jim Matthews. Jim, thank you for joining us. Jim has great experience and very knowledgeable in all areas of interest rate risk and process, and a great history of work. And again, he's an economic wonder that we call the professor. So, Jim, thank you for joining us also.
Well, thank you very much, Charlie. It's great to be here today with everyone.
All right. Well, a couple things just real quick administration wise. We are recording this webinar. If you'd like to get a copy of it, please reach out to your McQueen Financial advisor and their advisor give you a copy. It'll also be on our YouTube page. Happy to see that, and our website. So we do have all of our webinars out on our website. If anyone likes to see it for educational purposes to share with others inside of your institution, happy to do that. If you have any questions along the way, please feel free to pepper the team here with questions. There is a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. Click on that, type in your question. We'll answer it along the way on the fly or at the end, depending on what's most appropriate at the time. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Heather and Jim, and look forward to having some incredible education today.
Thanks, Charlie. So we're just going to do a little overview of what today is going to entail. And what we're going to do is this is part of our educational series, as Charlie had mentioned. Earlier this year, we began with an ALM 101, which was a kind of high-level introduction to the concept of ALM. So we're going to recap a little bit about what we discussed in that ALM 101. Then today, we're going to dive a little bit more into what we refer to as the art part of ALM, which has to do with the assumptions that drive how the model is going to work. And those assumptions are in regards to prepay speeds or non-maturity deposit retention, betas or rate sensitivity factors, and then talking about our replacement rates and how all of these things are impacting our spread and margin. And as Charlie had mentioned, at the end, we're going to be doing some Q&A. So throughout the webinar, please enter those questions as you see. So Jim, a little recap of what ALM 101, what did we talk about in that webinar?
Okay, Heather. Yeah, that webinar was great. We talked about what is ALM, right? And we talked about why we run the ALM modeling reports. Also, how the ALM analysis is performed. And the two key parts, the takeaways really of ALM, are net interest income, or the reward part of the equation, and the net economic value of equity, which is the risk part of the equation.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of moving pieces that go into ALM. And the general concept here is looking at that mix and volume of our interest rate sensitivity. I love the view of this teeter-totter here. And I'm Italian, I talk with my hands, I like views, I like images. And this is something that we're probably going to be referring to throughout today's webinar as well, is how that teeter-totter and that balance between both sides of the balance sheets are impacted by different assumptions. So when we look at that, we're looking at that liability side of our deposits and borrowings versus the asset side of our lending and investing. So we're really going to dive further into that detail today on how that teeter-totter bends and twists over time and what those assumptions impact can be. So Jim, why do we run ALM and why do we do this generally quarterly?
Oh, well, a lot goes on quarter to quarter. As I'm saying, a lot can go on week to week, right? Uh, certainly
Definitely.
certainly our balance sheets change. Last year the big story was deposit runoff, right? And we captured that. We captured that four times last year, each quarter. the new balance sheet composition. A loan demand changed throughout the year, right? The market changed, the market rate sets, the shape of the yield curve, prepayments, all of that. Everything we're going to discuss changes throughout the year, right? So it's important to really run ALM frequently, quarterly, as we do, to pick up on not just the changes in our balance sheet, but also the changes taking place in the market, the environment that we have, the opportunity that we have in the.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting to watch how sometimes the balance sheet doesn't change all that much, but the market itself changed enough to really tip that teeter-totter back and forth. So the second layer of this is, how do we do this analysis? How do we perform that?
Well, on quarter end, we take a snapshot of your balance sheet, right? Your loans, your investments, your deposits, and we run in a regulatory environment, right? So it's static balance sheet. No growth is assumed. We can assume growth in what if scenarios, but that quarterly ALM run is a snapshot of your current balance sheet with standardized risk assessments, that instantaneous parallel permanent rate shocks.
Yeah, it's really nice knowing that we have to do that no growth as our standard starting point, which is a great baseline for us to then run those simulations or those what ifs, and utilizing that simulator to test all the different things that we can do. And one of the first tests that we always focus on is that net interest income.
Yes, the reward part of the equation, right? The parameterization there is over a 12-month time horizon. We're using annualized net interest income from that evaluation that we go out 12 months. The level of repricing activity that takes place is going to be dictated by the asset mix and the liability mix in the balance sheet. And our goal is to disclose earnings sensitivity of the institution in these rate shock environments. The up to down 100 basis point iterations is the regulatory metric. The down 400, the up 400 is a snapshot of where we would be 100 basis points either way in that regulatory window.
Yep. And it's great information for decision making. We're going to talk more today about how these things all tie together, how the assumptions tip that scale. So the next piece that we refer to is really looking at that net economic value of equity, or NEV. And so when we look at risk, we don't want to eliminate risk. We want to be profitable. We want to have a margin. We want to mitigate our risk or establish appropriate thresholds for our institution to make sure that this type of risk makes sense for us. And that's where those green check marks you can see in this sample of having that policy range that we are comfortable to stay within, and testing to see where we are today. So when we look at NEV, a couple things that we kind of just want to recap here is looking at different durations are going to have different impact. And just a quick visual from the asset side is looking at three different terms, looking at 30-year mortgages versus 4 or 5 year, say, auto loans on average versus overnight funds that reprice with the market immediately. And again, referring back to that teeter-totter, if you think of the longevity of a longer duration product, is going to pull that teeter-totter down further. You're going to have more risk, especially in an up scenario. If we're booking 3% mortgages, we did in 21, and now those are closer to 7%, that's not going to hold nearly as much value because you are holding those loans for a significantly longer period of time. Now, the offset is you're going to hold those rates as rates go down. So that's why you see that positive risk position in the down scenario, but it's more risky in an up scenario. So always taking into consideration duration is going to tip that teeter-totter back and forth. And then as we look at the liability side, this is that counterintuitive side where that value adjustment is what you're taking away from your assets, leaving the remainder is what equity you have left at the end of the day. So the less of the liability that we take away from the asset, the more value we hold. So the liability side is always kind of counterintuitive. And we're going to talk about some of the assumptions and some of the factors that go into play that's causing our sensitivity to look a little different, whether we're looking at an up scenario or down scenario. And we're going to kind of look at a few of those things today. So Jim, just our overall summary, kind of a small recap here before we dive into 201.
Right. So, ALM, the reports that we produce, it's not just for your regulators, right? We don't just take the report, throw it in the file, and wait for our examiners to show up, right? So, something that
Right.
we can use every single quarter, right? To look at the impact of any kind of new products or strategies we have on our balance sheet to assess whether we can take more risk, right? That NEV that Heather just went over. How does our risk to capital look? And also to stay ahead of any kind of potential problems we have, right? And serially, last year we saw balances coming down, perhaps some borrowings come on the balance sheet. All of that was tracked quarter over quarter, and we saw what happened to our NEV, and we also saw that income projection that goes out 12 months. That is that proactive approach, right? Where we see what's going on with our spread and our margin.
Yeah. It was interesting for many years. ALM didn't really move. It didn't really budge. We were in this very flat market for many, many years. Now, this is a very, very different world. And the importance of looking at these numbers often, making sure that we're reviewing the assumptions that are going in to make sure they're still reasonable. And this is some of the things that we're really going to focus on today is the model assumptions, that piece, that art side of ALM, our prepay speeds. Those speeds have changed significantly and they continue to change. Non-maturity deposit retention, liquidity issues and things that we've experienced, that retention doesn't look like it did a few years ago. Looking at our betas, how fast are we responding to the market? What we did 10 years ago may not be what we're doing today, and some of the lags that may go into play, making sure we're pricing appropriately and those replacement rates and how much that drives some of these outputs and sensitivities. So the key of all of these pieces, and again, that art side of ALM, is accurate assumptions equals accurate results. And the current market that we've experienced in the last couple of years is really given us a fantastic view of how we respond, making sure we're reviewing these assumptions, that they're still relevant for us. And we've got a really good view of how we did respond, and we can incorporate some of that activity into those assumptions to make sure that they're relevant for today. And that impact to spread and margin is so vital for us right now as we're seeing some compression here. And again, we're going to talk a little bit more about that today and how those things are occurring and what to expect over the next year. So Jim, one of the first things is our prepay speeds. What is a prepay? What does this mean to us?
Oh, it means a lot, Heather. Thanks for asking. Well, we think of prepayment speeds as CPR. There's a few different ways to look at prepayment speeds, but we use CPR, which is a conditional prepayment rate conditioned on the available rate in the market versus our current rate, right? And also a constant prepayment rate, right? So either one of those, conditional or constant, works for CPR for the description, right? Because once we establish that CPR in the base case for a given analysis and in that rate shock for a given analysis, we hold that speed constant in that environment for the life of those cash flows, right? So it's constant. And the number itself is conditional on the disparity between the coupon on the loan and also the market available rate, right? So when we look at a percent, right, CPR, we see a number on a screen. It's the additional percentage, the annualized additional percentage of the extra principal we're receiving over and above the contractually scheduled principal payments, right? A recent study has shown that 90% of the prepayment speed that we have, this accelerator, if you will, to principal payments comes from refinancing activity. Another 10% of the extra principal payments are from folks who want to speed up their loan a little bit, right? But 90% of this is that refi opportunity that the borrower has when their mortgage rates go down. Right? And we update these prepayment speeds every quarter in the model when we run the ALM. It's a new set of assumptions. And again, that assumption for each loan type in each rate scenario is held constant for the life of those cash flows.
So Jim, why would we update those speeds on a quarterly basis? Since it's an
Well,
annual percentage, won't we just do that once a year?
Well, it's expressed as an annual percentage, so we can wrap our head around what's going on with that number, right? But these speeds, as we see, have changed, right? If we think back 2.5 years ago, mortgages were 3%. Today they're 7%, and they've been 7% for over a year now, right? So we had a big change in mortgage rates, market rates, because of the Fed and because of the monetary restrictions that are going on. So those prepayment speeds plummeted, and we're going to look at that on the next slide. But yeah, it's very important to update your prepayment speeds to keep them current. You mentioned earlier, Heather, that we've had some very dull years in ALM where these prepayments haven't moved much, right? We were at 3% mortgages for quite some time, and then rates ramped up very, very suddenly. So we have quarter-to-quarter changes that are bigger than year-over-year changes in some observed periods, right? So it's very important to update those every quarter.
Yeah, and I love this page. I think it gives us a great visual of how fast that can change. So it looks like we kind of have two ends of the spectrum here of what caused those speeds to fluctuate so much. How and what are these tables telling us, and what's the correlation between these two values?
Okay, well, there's an inverse correlation, right? This is really a correlation of -1, if you will, right? The blue bars are it's the Fannie Mae commitment rate, right? So those are mortgage rates, right, at the agency level, and the green line are conditional prepayment rates, right? That's CPR that we see, the observed CPR. So we see in December of 2020, rates were very, very low, and prepayments were very, very high, right? So we had CPRs that were approaching on the chart here over 50%, right? And then we see in December 2020, rates started coming up a little bit. CPR started coming down. Some of that may be a burnout effect. But by 2022, we see rates came up substantially, and we see that CPRs really, really came down. Like that refinanceability that we saw in prior years is totally gone, right? And if we look back at 2017, 2018, where rates came up just a little bit, right? If we just look at those first two bars on the left-hand side, we see that behavior in a much more muted part, right? It's not as drastic as we see with the big rate moves. So we know that CPRs are not only negatively correlated to rates, CPRs go up when rates come down, but that magnitude of change in rates is very important for the magnitude of change in the CPR.
Yeah, it's amazing how the market can really drive what that activity is going to look like. And as we looked at it before, where we're looking and seeing most speeds are weighted where about like you had mentioned, the 90% usually is from refinancing, and that 10% is just from extra principal payments. I actually use myself as an example of this. We refinanced our mortgage back in 21, locked in well under 3%, but I kept that payment right where it was before. So all that extra principal that I'm not paying from an interest standpoint is just that extra payments. That's why you're still seeing a little bit of prepay speeds, despite the fact that these rates are so low. You're still seeing a little bit extra principal coming due. So there's always some type of speed there. But how that activity changes depending on that rate environment is going to tip that scale. And you can see that on this page, whereas rates go up, that's going to slow down those prepay speeds. That incentive to refinance just isn't there. Now, if rates come down, we're expecting those speeds to speed back up just because that incentive at those lower interest rates is going to be there. It'll be very interesting to see if and when rates do start to come down, considering some of the lags of some of that pricing, we may still be below what that market's at. So we're expecting those rates to speed up in a down scenario, but it'll be very interesting to see what that impact's going to look like just because of that disparity or spread between our pool rates and what that market offering is actually happening.
Yeah, Heather and Jim, just hop in here for a second. Quick question came in. I believe you answered a good chunk of it, but I think it'd be nice to address. Do prepayment speeds adjust or change as you change the rate environment in your model? I would assume that prepays wouldn't remain the same if the rate environment increased or decreased. And so the answer is yes, but go ahead and elaborate.
Yes, Charlie, in two different ways. And we see on the next slide, if you will, we see the rate shocks where the prepayments change, right? There's the elasticity that we see, and I don't mean to jump right in front of Heather's discussion here.
But,
we see the flooring that takes place in the uprate scenarios of 6% for mortgages, right? The base case is 6.2, and in the down rate scenarios, we see the prepayment propensity picks up, right? That's that curvature that Heather was just showing on the prior slide. Now, that base case in yellow changes every single quarter, right? And depending on how much rates change, there can be a profound change in the base, right? For quite a while, our base case in a 30-year mortgage was 17, 18%. Now it's just above the floor, right? When we had a 3% mortgage, that was a hot money mortgage. Now people have a 3% mortgage in a 7% environment, a very, very big disincentive to refinance, right? So yes, they do change in the rate shocks as printed. This is really a snapshot from an ALM report. And they also change quarterly, right? So that curvature changes and also the base case changes every quarter. And we see the display of the prepayments for the rate shock for a given quarter on this slide here.
Yep. And it's so important to continue to update these and reflect what's going on in today's market because it's changing our cash flow, especially on the mortgage side of the balance sheet. As these speeds are getting slower and slower and flooring out, that cash flow is lengthening out. Again, it's pulling that teeter-totter down. It's causing us more sensitivity in an up scenario, especially on NEV. So it is very pertinent to make sure that we are looking at these speeds, making sure they're appropriate, and reviewing them often because as the rates change and the market changes, these speeds are going to adjust with that activity as well. And when you look at different types of products, those are going to have different inherently faster or slower different types of speed depending on the product itself. So when we look at mortgages, because they are such longer term in comparison to the remaining part of our balance sheet, especially on lending, those speeds are going to look a little different than our autos. Autos tend to turn over at a much faster pace. They're inherently very short in comparison, and these are going to update as time goes on as well. We were actually seeing a lot of these prepay speeds on autos well into the 30s prior to this slowdown or this large increase in interest rates. So these speeds have slowed down significantly, but still you see a big difference between one asset class to another. So it's very important to review these, make sure that they're still appropriate for us, watching what the market's doing, but also watching what our balance sheet is doing. Just because the market is acting in a certain manner, our activity that we're seeing from our institution may be slightly different. So there are times where it's appropriate to do a prepay study and incorporate those speeds that we're seeing on our balance sheet to make sure that that cash flow is more appropriate for us than what the general market may be giving us. So there's definitely some play here to make sure that we're establishing the right speeds for us. So, Jim, just to kind of wrap up our prepay speed discussion, usually whenever we go through each of these parts, what are some of the questions we need to ask ourselves to make sure we're doing the right things?
Well, certainly the first bullet point here, reasonable and supportable, not just for prepayments, but all the assumptions we're going to look at today. And is our institution different than the general market, right? We have clients that have a particular segment and they have very, very different outcomes for their lending experience than the rest of the country, right? Namely, some very, very large mortgages on the West Coast, right? They prepay more rapidly than a smaller mortgage that is not in California, right? To name a state. So
it's always different in California for some reason.
It is, yeah. It's I'm from New York. I'd say it's better in California. Right? I love it out there. But yeah, it's so we need to think about our institution and the specific behavior that goes on our balance sheet versus what would be a national average, right? And the third part is are our examiners asking us about our prepayment speeds, right? Do we need to have a study to tie back what is the industry standard, if that's what we're using, to our own experience? And boy, I can tell you with the rate move we've had in the past couple of years, prepayments, they have moved a lot, and experiences have been very, very different by institution too. So it's not like one of these smooth sailing situations where the Fed moves 25 basis points a year, where they don't move at all, right? We had hundreds of basis points of movements over the course of 18 months, and what is projected versus what actually happened can certainly be quite disparate.
Yeah, it's been definitely interesting to see how different activity has happened across the nation from one piece to another. All right. So prepay speeds is definitely an important aspect, and that's definitely a big impact to our cash flow. So that's one of the first major pieces of assumptions that go into that art side of ALM. So now let's pivot over to probably one of the biggest focus points we've seen in the last year or so is our non-maturity deposit retention. This seems to be a big focus, and a lot of activity has been going on. So can you kind of give us a overview of exactly what type of products are we talking about here?
Okay, so and anything on our liability side of the balance sheet that does not have a stated final maturity. Our share CDs have a stated final maturity. Our borrowings, if we have them, have a stated final maturity. So we're thinking about our share accounts, our checking accounts, our IRA accounts, money market accounts, anything that a depositor leaves with us that it does not have a maturity, as a behavioral maturity. And that's what we're trying to find when we think about assumptions for non-maturity deposit retention. We know we're not fighting to keep those dollars there every single night. It's not wholesale funding, right? It's not something where we have to go to the Fed window for. But we have to establish or try to establish a reasonable maturity for these deposits because they are very important sources of our funding.
They are, and there's definitely been some changes and fluctuations that's been going on in regards to retention. It seems like this pandemic has definitely thrown some swings at us that we generally haven't experienced in such a short or concentrated period of time.
Yeah, exactly, Heather. And this chart, this graph that we have is a tremendous way to show that, right? This blue line, it looks kind of like a parabola here. We see in 2020, deposits were at a specific level and our cost of funds were at a specific level. And then we got more and more deposits, right? We had a lot of fiscal stimulus going on, the CARES Act, the PPP loans, a bunch of different things going on. That drove deposits into our institution as rates were going lower, right? So we had this serendipity of having plenty of deposits and they were very cheap. And then we reverse engines, right? We had inflation come in and we had a situation where the Fed is tightening rates, where the money supply was shrinking. M2, which is on the liability side of our balance sheet, was getting smaller, right? This is all part and parcel of what the Fed was doing, trying to accomplish monetary restraints to choke off inflation. So we see our cost of funds increased tremendously and our deposits came down. Right? So it's kind of counterintuitive. You would think if you're paying more for something, you would have more of it. But the exact opposite effect, right? It seems like deposits are really governed by money supply more so than the rate that we pay. But the rate that we pay is very important to keep our deposits vis-a-vis our competitors. Right?
Yeah, it's been very interesting to see the pace of change that's occurred in regards to the volume, to the cost, to all of these moving parts. Now, for the most part, we've seen a large increase in cost of funds that's been primarily on the term side. That's an easier area for us to control our cost and to not increase basically overnight. Now, with that being said, as Jim, as you have pointed out, that cost did go up and our deposits continue to go down. So when we look at retention and we look at that change over time, we want to identify our sticky deposits versus our rate shopping products. And different types of products are going to generally have different types of activities. So what we want to do is not only look at what's been happening historically, but making sure that we're capturing the right thing for going forward. So these next two slides are really going to kind of show us some of that activity change from a couple different views. We have seen a lot of focus from examiners over the last year to 18 months in regards to non-maturity deposits. There was a very big concern with all of those deposits running in because of all that stimulus money. Now, overhead is more expensive, so a lot of people are using those funds to pay just their daily bills and groceries, but then also you're seeing that money run out and go to other places. So with that combination happening, what we want to identify is what type of retention are we seeing from the activity from our deposits. So when we look at our historical trends of things, we want to say, and if we look back, and this is kind of giving us a view of a core deposit study over time. We generally recommend to run these every 2 years, and to see the changes that have occurred has been quite interesting. So using just non-interest bearing deposit, one of our most standard types of accounts that pretty much all of us have, what's been the activity of that account over time? Well, our retention back in 2017 to look over that 5-year history was 89%. Then in 19, it had gone up to 90s, showing that we're holding more funds or staying with us for a longer period of time. We got to 21, which was that peak of those deposits coming in and then slowly starting to come off. These dropped slightly. But now, if you look at that activity that happened from 21 to 23, you can see that number going down to 80%. So when we look at these bars and we see these changes, there was a very large drop in deposits there. And this is looking at the number of accounts that we see. Now, this may be moving to other locations, but for the most part, you're just seeing these totally go away. Different product types are going to have different types of activity. So we want to look at that as one of the first steps. Now, the second is looking at the balance shifts that have occurred. Many examiners have been concerned with surge deposits or seeing a large amount of deposits leaving the institution. That was some of the liquidity crunch and concern that we saw in the last year and a half or so. But the problem with this view is this seemed to be a more isolated activity, not something that we're expecting to continuously go on for the same at the same pace that we just experienced. And a lot of this fast in and out was because of that stimulus activity. So what we want to do is not only look at the recent activity and apply that as our retention, we want to look at the entire picture. So if we go back to a 5-year term and we look at from before the pandemic to where we are now, what did those balances do? For some products, those balances dropped. If I look at money markets right here, I can see the balances fluctuate, went up, and then dropped. These are more those rate shopper types of products. Generally, money markets are more expensive, so you're going to see those moving around. Unlike savings accounts, which are our big core sticky types of accounts, what type of activity happened here? Well, if we looked at just the last couple of years, you see a very big drop of over about $2.5 million ran out the door. But let's reel it back to before the pandemic. We were about $14 million, and now we're at about 16. So we're actually still at a higher point than where we started. So again, we have to look at the big picture of all the moving pieces that have been happening. From a historical standpoint on the number of accounts that have closed, we have a retention rate of 93%. If I use our balance shift that have changed over time, we're over 100, meaning that we're ending at a higher starting point than where we ending at a higher point than where we started. So these are all of those things that you want to look at. You want to look at the different product types. You want to see the activities on the closures, and you want to see the activities of those balance swings. We got to look at all of those moving parts to come together to make sure we have an appropriate assumption when it comes to the term that we're using in the model, because we're going to value that against alternative funding sources. So if we are using an appropriate term, we can really have an appropriate measure of the value of those deposits. But we really want to look at all of these moving pieces. So what we've actually done here at McQueen on our core deposit study is actually expanded the ability to look at both count activity and balance activity and be able to look at both of those and weigh them together in appropriate way to make sure we have the appropriate assumptions, knowing that this surge is a more isolated incident. We don't expect this to be at the same pace continuously for years to come. So Jim, this our next slide here kind of gives us a little bit of a view of what that impact may look like in regards to value in comparison to what our market alternatives are. You know, kind of what is this showing us here?
Oh, well, this is 2 scenarios here, right? This is the green line. We see we've got more beneficial net economic value in declining rate scenarios and more detrimental value in the rising rate scenarios. The blue line mutes that entire effect, right? And the blue line represents a longer dated assumption for these non-maturity deposits, right? If we think of the asset side of our balance sheet as a sail, right? If we're going sailing, we have our sail all the way up. Well, if we have our sail all the way up, we better have the deep rudder, right? And that's on maturity deposits, right? Or else our boat is going to tip over. So a long dated assumption in non-maturity deposits, as rates rise, we have less detriment, right? Because there's a sympathetic decrease to the value of those deposits, right? But as rates decline, it kind of curtails that value that we see on the asset side of the balance sheet, right? The non-maturity deposits also rise in value, right? So it's a muting effect of the risk, but we can't just put in a number that feels good in the model, right? We have to look at our deposits. We have to do a study. We have to do our homework on this to arrive at what is a reasonable assumption for our non-maturity deposits. But this certainly is the effect, showing the difference between the green line, which is a relatively shorter non-maturity deposit assumption, versus the blue line that has a little bit more length to that assumed maturity.
Again, back to that teeter-totter where you're more drastic this way, where if we lengthen that out, it's going to offset, but it's not going to give us as much value in that down. Again, that's that balancing between both sides of what's appropriate so that our balance sheet can handle any of those rate shock scenarios. And that's what we want to look at. Not just one direction, but we got to look at both because the market can go either direction. So again, that balance between both sides. So this next view kind of looks at it in a little bit different perspective, but what are these percentages kind of showing us?
Okay, so these are price movements, right? When we look at our core deposits versus a generic funding source. And when we look at the price movement of this funding source, in rising rate scenarios, the funding source retains more value. In the declining rate scenarios, the funding source has a little bit less appreciation, right? So our funding source is assumed to be a shorter maturity than our core deposits, right? The core deposit in this example is giving us more of that sympathetic decrease as rates rise, the value decrease, which helps to offset the decrease in our assets. And then as rates go down, we've got more price appreciation with the core deposit, and that's offsetting the beneficial effect on the liability. So it's another way of showing what we just saw on the last slide, but we're showing like a price sensitivity that's taking place between a funding source and the core deposit.
Yeah. Again, it goes back to that counterintuitive view for liabilities where the smaller the number is, the less you're taking away from your assets and the more value that holds. So you can see, just like we saw in the previous graph, in that up scenario shows a little bit more benefit, but in that down scenario, it's not quite as much benefit. But again, that counterintuitive view on that liability. So deposits are definitely an important piece. And so we've talked about prepays, we've talked about our non-maturity deposits. So the third piece of this is our betas and rate sensitivity factors. Definitely an important part, but definitely has a lot of moving pieces that kind of go into those decisions, huh?
No, absolutely, Heather. This is key, very much so, to our income simulation when we do that, right? So in the model, we're moving rates 100, 200, 300 basis points from a regulatory standpoint, and then we do 400 basis points just to show a little bit exaggerated on either end of the regulatory. But how do our assets move? How do our liabilities move? And what governs that movement on the balance sheet, right? So the factors to consider, the product type we have. Is it a fixed rate or a variable rate product? Are there caps and floors involved? And also periodic caps, right? Something that is much smaller than a lifetime cap. And typically it's defined over 12 months, really a periodic cap. So all of that plays into the factoring in what our rate sensitivity is going to be for a given rate shock for a given product.
Yep. Yeah, this next page really kind of shows an example of a little bit more complex type of loan. And when I say complex, just meaning as a variable rate product, you have to take into consideration caps, you have to take into consideration floors, but you also have to look at that periodic cap. And what that periodic cap is what is the allowed activity over the next 12 months. So even though this is a variable rate item where it may have a lifetime increase cap of 6%, When we go to run this in the model, we're only looking at the next 12 months. So when we go to do that, we need to ensure that we have captured the allowed activity of that product type. So an example here is showing a mortgage, a variable rate mortgage that has a periodic cap of 2%. So when you go to run this in the model, you need to make sure that when we go to do these rising rate scenarios, that we stop out that replacement rate when the periodic cap tells us to. So for example, we start off at a, say, a 642 as a replacement, our periodic cap is 2%. If rates go up 100 basis points and it's a variable rate product, it's going to move in lockstep with the market. Assume it's tied to an indice such as prime. The market moves up 100 basis points. This mortgage variable product is going to move up another 100 basis points. So if we go from a 642, we go up to a 742 if rates go up 100, 842 and the up 200. And then you see the 3 and 4 look exactly the same as that up 200. That's your periodic cap stopping any additional repricing that is outside of the means of that loan. So that's an important piece to make sure we capture, because that is going to reduce that interest, that net interest income in that up scenario, because we're not going to get that continued benefit of that increase. So if that product is structured in that manner, we got to make sure that we're reflecting that in those assumptions. Now, the same goes for any flooring. So for this product type, they had a weighted average floor of 276. So you can see in the down scenarios, we drop 100 basis points with the market, another 100 with the 2, 3, all of a sudden down the down 400, we only go down 66 basis points. That's because we reached the floor of the 276. We're not going to be able to reduce that any lower. So again, that teeter-totter, you're not going to get as much benefit on that up scenario because we stop at 2%. And that down scenario, it's not going to be as beneficial to us, but it's also going to keep us from dropping below that 276 as well. So these are all of those moving parts in that detail to ensure that we're capturing when we go to model these types of products. Now, our fixed rate items are usually a little easier, a little bit more straightforward. Most times we see that fixed rate products aren't going to be as price sensitive. Usually going to have a little bit of lag there. As a general market statement, we usually see that if the market raises 100 basis points, we're only going to go about 75% of that movement. And that's generally how we price those loans. So again, reviewing what our activity looks like, how rate sensitive are we by product type, and making sure those betas of how fast we're repricing is reflecting the activity that we're actually doing. And again, these last year to 18 months has really given us a really good view on what those responses are and making sure we're reflecting that appropriately. So Jim, we've got some investments. Do these act similar to loans? Is there a little variation here?
Yeah, very similar to loans. When we think about overnight funds, the ultimate variable rate asset, right? That's going to take the entire rate shock. And in this environment, we're not floored, right? 2.5 years ago, we would have floored. Even this down 400, a year ago, we would have floored, or a little over a year ago. So we are able to move the full 100 basis points lower to down 400. And also the full 100 basis points higher. So we capture that entire elasticity that we have in the rate shock. For CDs, akin to what we saw just now on the loans, 75 basis points per 100, right? So on up 300, we're going up 225 basis points. We realize that as rates move higher, the yield curve is market directional, right? There's a mean aversion to rates, so we don't have 30-year mortgages moving up 525 basis points when the Fed funds rate moves up 525 basis points, right? It was more like closer to 400 basis points. And that was an extreme move. Typically, it's about 60% or 62% movement in a 30-year instrument versus Fed funds. So we capture that effect for the income simulation with the betas, right? We capture the effect that fixed rate, longer dated product doesn't move as rapidly as a very, very short dated product or an overnight fund. Right?
And one thing I always stress as well is making sure that we understand none of this is set in stone. The market and our responses change over time. So these are things that we need to review, I would say at least on an annual basis. If there's any major changes that have happened in recent times, definitely review those. But this is a moving target right along with the market. So making sure that we're reviewing this and making sure it's appropriate. Now, when we get to the it seems like on the liability side, we definitely we've got some highlights and some focuses here. We've inherently got a little bit of an issue in regards to this down scenario with pricing that can impact really kind of our spread and margin.
Absolutely, Heather. Yeah, excellent point. And I speak with clients all the time who are very efficiently funded, right? They've done very, very well containing the cost of their non-maturity deposits. But in down rate scenarios, they have big negative outcomes, right? Because they've got that nice spread, that net spread of where the assets can range down hundreds of basis points and the non-maturity deposits, the checking, the money market that we see on this slide, floors right away, right? So no good deed goes unpunished. You're doing great in the base case, but you floor right away on the liability side, and it gives you that negative net interest income sensitivity in declining rate scenarios. In this example here, checking is only going down 6 basis points in the first 100, and there's no additional savings, right? We're not going to model negative rates. The money market, they start off at 115 basis points, and they can go down 40 beta for the first 2 rate shocks, and only 30 of that 40 in the down 300, and then they're flooring. With regard to the 48-month CDs, and we have that inverted yield curve. We still have a bit of an inverted yield curve. So those longer dated CDs actually can floor more so than your overnight funds, right? So, in this example, we're going down 75 basis points for the first 2 100 basis point rate shocks, and then only 48 basis points for the down 300 before we floor. Rising rate scenarios, there's no flooring, clearly, right? We're using a beta of 20 basis points for checking in this example, 40 basis points for money market, and then that's 75 basis points for the CDs. But flooring is a big effect when we have a low base rate, right? That replacement rate in the base case is very efficient, and it floors right away in the model.
Yeah, and we're definitely going to talk about that here in just a second in regards to spread and margin and how some of this is really going to kind of amplify that squeeze that we may be experiencing, especially if rates start to come down a bit. So it's definitely something to monitor and watch. But a quick example on this page is looking at even in a over 500 basis point rate environment where the Fed funds rate is, if we're still only paying, say, 7 basis points on checking, we may want to review these betas at 20 and say, well, if rates go up another 100, we're probably not going to pay 27 basis points because still we're at 7. We can't make these 0 by any means, but at least it's something to review and identify the highest point we've ever paid versus that lowest and try to back into some of these values that are appropriate.
Yeah, and Heather, that's an excellent point. We see through 525 basis point of rate hikes, and there's 7 basis points, but the examiners would never let us get away with a 2 basis point. Yeah,
No, no, definitely not much there. But looking at this overall replacement rates, making sure that we're pricing things appropriately, making sure that our cost of funds are priced accordingly, and that those betas are reflecting what's going on. Making sure dealer fees on indirect loans has become a big focus point. So making sure we're capturing those yields over coupons, especially when we go to run those income simulations. We want to get the net yield of what we're actually earning. So we kind of look at this like a bond, that yield versus coupon. These are all those moving parts that we want to take into consideration. So just really honing in on that area. So when we talk about repricing, Jim, one of the things that we want to do is make sure that we continue to price our products appropriately. And we've got some great tools on our Navigator to kind of help guide some of those decision making from one product type to another. Definitely a few items on here to take into consideration when we look at that pricing.
Yeah, and this I love this chart, right?
Me too.
The build-up method. We think about the risk-free U.S. Treasury, and that's right around 4.25 for the 5-year note right now, with the 3-year. 3 years a little bit above that, but this is the rate where we can sit home in our bunny slippers and hit a button and get 4.25%, right? To that, we need to add our CECL allowance, right? We need to think about any kind of credit spread we have because there's credit risk involved that isn't involved in our risk-free rate, right? Servicing, right? We have to take that into account. And then our desired return. What is our target return on assets or return on equity, right? So for example, our build-up rate for a generic loan is 775 basis points or 7.75%. The smaller bit here on the same page, we see the booked rate and then the replacement rate, right? And that disparity is showing by and large that we're in a higher rate environment, a rising rate environment, because the replacement rates are above our booked rates, right? Now we do see 30-year mortgages are below what we've established for our build-up rate, right? That's 7.75 versus 7.25. Well, for 30-year mortgages, we don't have a lot of CECL loss, right? We've got a lot of collateral there, right? It may take some time to get it, right? But we don't need the kind of CECL allowance for a 30-year mortgage that we would perhaps for a used auto loan, right? So we can come down a little bit. It's no secret where 30-year mortgage rates are. We're either on market or we're not on market. So, here the replacement rate is reflective of a competitive rate, but an acceptable competitive rate, right? And then we see unsecured a little bit more nebulous, right? We don't want to be, cutting our CECL allowance for that type of loan, and used auto, same type of thing. Right?
Yep, it's great to be able to use those tools and look at how we've priced things right now, because some of our biggest concerns is that squeeze of margin over time. So I'm going to quickly touch base on this graph, and we're going to go on to the next one that kind of shows what that trend has happened, is watching how fast our changes have occurred. So looking at our loan rates that have changed over time, looks like we've come up nicely, another 183 basis points, versus if we come down here, we can see that we've increased our cost of funds, especially on that term deposit side, by 221 basis points. So that constant increase of our expenses is outpacing the increase of those assets. So these are some of the things that we got to take into consideration when we look at pricing, when we look at the future, and knowing what to be prepared for. When we look at this next page here, we're going to see that spread and margin and that trend that's been occurring. Seems like we've got a little bit of squeeze going on here, Jim.
Yeah, certainly, Heather, indeed. And this is a great page. I love this. This is right out of our ALM detail report, and it gives us some history, both graphically and then numerically, for both net interest spread, which is simply the asset yield minus the liability cost, and our net interest margin, which is the difference between our interest income and our interest expense expressed as a percent of average assets. Right? So two different ways to look: spread and margin, and it's all right here. And it goes back 12 months, and then it gives us our 12-month projection. So yeah, and you can see the trending taking place, right? That pressure on deposits, and the fact that we're paying up a little bit, right?
And the thing that you had showed earlier on some of those non-maturity deposits is most of those are low, and there's not a lot of room to reduce that cost. It's really that focus on that term deposit side. So making sure that we're honing in and focusing on those areas and know that what to be prepared for as that squeeze continues to happen. So just to kind of recap some of the things we talked about today is just really always ask yourself, are our assumptions reasonable and supportable? We need to make sure that prepay speeds are appropriate for what's going on. And our market may look very different than the general market. Make sure we're capturing that. Those non-maturity deposit retention terms. I cannot stress how much we see the focus from examiners and auditors, making sure those terms make sense. Look at the count adjustments, look at the balance shifts that are occurring, look at the big picture of all of that activity that's going on to make sure that we're comfortable with that output, especially in today's market, as liquidity is that main focus point. The betas, again, we can use the recent activity to help guide what those reasonable assumptions are. And it's supportable because we've actually experienced that type of shift. This is one of the best times to go back and look at those values and do those updates to reflect that current activity of what we do today. And then obviously the repricing on rates is really important to really protect us, especially if rates start to come down. We want to do everything that we can to continue to be in a nice, strong position. So again, accurate assumptions give us accurate results, so then we can then use our crystal ball to look to the future to make sure we're making those right decisions for strategic planning. This will lead us into our 301 part of our educational series that will be later this year, that will help us as we get into budgeting season. We want to make sure we tie up all of these assumptions going in so that we know what's going on in the balance sheet and we can make those proper decisions to be able to stay independent and profitable long term. So.
Wow. Amazing, guys. Great great conversation, I'd say. Not even a lecture, conversation, communication. Well done.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us, Tim.
Sorry about
Thanks.
that. Quick cough there. Hey, wanted to just have a couple questions, but one that's bubbled up from actually a good friend. When looking at ALM reporting and thinking about all the variabilities you put in, how I'm disseminating the question, I apologize. How often do you go back and test your assumptions? For example, prepayment speeds, how often do you review them to make sure they're correct?
That's a great question. And it can vary. If there's a significant change in the market, then we may want to generally look at that. In today's market, an annual review of your prepay speeds is probably more than appropriate. We're going to see changes occur, but that annual review really gives us a really good snapshot of what that activity looks like. You're going to see most of the movement there. When you look at a core deposit for non-maturity deposit retention, that generally doesn't move as quickly as prepays, and we usually recommend every 2 years. That is a big focus point right now. So this would be our suggestion, is maybe starting that process within this next little bit and probably repeat that every other year.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Another question that popped in, and we'll take this as the last one, so we wrap right up on time. Everyone get off to their next meeting here. When looking at the future, would you please tell us what's going to happen?
We got to go back to the crystal ball.
Crystal ball.
Charles. Yeah, boy, your guess is as good as mine. I guess we're thinking perhaps 225 basis point rate cuts by the Fed sometime this calendar year, September or November, and then perhaps in December. Of course, we were thinking about 6 or 8 rate cuts last December for calendar 2024. So I think we need to be attuned to where inflation is coming in, what's going on with the labor market,
Yep.
certainly, the election, everything that's taking place. But we are thinking that rates will be coming down in the not too distant future, at least from a mild standpoint. And in 2025, I think there's also a downward bias to rates.
Yeah. I think, Jim, you're answering exactly off the Fed funds futures and what the Fed's been stating, which is the safest answer. It is a good one. And it may be a little longer. It might be the beginning of next year. I do think the crystal ball is a great thing, and data dependency is a great thing. Looking at what inflation does, that's going to be one of the key drivers here too. But I do think in the end, we always want to make sure we're going to perform well in all interest rate environments. So I love the trick question for you. But we want to make sure that your institution performs well if rates come down, or if rates go up, or rates stay the same, because no one knows exactly what's going to happen in the future. So we don't want to make a bet. We want to be balanced. With that, I really want to thank you, Jim. Really appreciate your insights. Great information. Heather, thank you very much. Appreciate your insights and great information. And thank all of you for attending. Just a quick update here. We do have our next webinar coming up, Investments 301. Will be happening on August 22nd at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Please join us. I believe this is going to be our first Investments 301. We've added a new series this year to get one step deeper. So with that, thank everyone for joining us very much. I want to thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your day and a great summer.
Thanks, Charlie. Thanks, Heather.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.